She walked through the streets of Caracas in 2019, a foreign correspondent whose editors had sent her to document the final chapter of a nation's demise. The assignment brief was simple: capture the death throes of a failed petrostate. What she found instead was a puzzle that would force her to question everything she thought she knew about economic collapse and the stories we tell ourselves about other nations. The world has written Venezuela's obituary. The narrative is complete and universally accepted. Venezuela is the cautionary tale of our time, a resource-rich nation that descended into chaos through corruption and mismanagement. This story is told with such certainty that questioning it seems almost perverse. But what if this entire narrative is wrong? What if Venezuela's story reveals more about how we think about nations than about Venezuela itself? The mirage of measurement, the framework through which the outside world views Venezuela, rests on assumptions that have proven remarkably persistent despite contradictory evidence. The first is equating economic statistics with reality. When observers see hyperinflation rates and GDP contraction, they assume complete understanding. But the Venezuela in economic data and the Venezuela on the ground are different countries entirely. Consider hyperinflation. Venezuela experienced prices rising over 1 million %. Every textbook says this should cause complete social breakdown. Yet Venezuela survived and began recovering through mechanisms existing outside formal economic theory. The country developed what economists couldn't measure: resilience systems invisible to traditional analysis. The second assumption is institutional determinism, that weak institutions inevitably cause failure. This suggests Venezuela's problems stem from authoritarian governance and corruption. Yet this cannot explain why the country maintained social cohesion during crisis, or why alternative institutions emerged filling gaps left by traditional structures. The third assumption treats Western market capitalism as humanity's natural destination. Venezuela's experiment with 21st century socialism is seen not as an alternative path, but as a dead end. This prevents observers from seeing what Venezuela actually became: not a failed Western economy, but something genuinely different: the innovation of crisis. What foreign observers miss is Venezuela's extraordinary capacity for improvisation. While traditional banking struggled with hyperinflation, Venezuelans pioneered digital payment systems, bypassing these constraints entirely. Before Western countries experimented with digital currencies, Venezuela had become a laboratory for post-traditional monetary systems. This emerged organically from necessity refined through collective intelligence. Venezuelan entrepreneurs developed mobile payments functioning with unreliable connectivity, digital wallets preserving value during volatility, and peer-to-peer exchanges operating outside formal banking. The genius solved multiple problems simultaneously, providing value storage during hyperinflation, enabling commerce when traditional methods failed, creating economic organization more resilient than formal structures. This adaptation extends beyond payments. Communities developed cooperative organizations providing social services when government capacity declined. They created supply chains functioning despite import restrictions. They pioneered urban agriculture, providing food security in densely populated areas. Each innovation was invisible to outside observers because they operated outside frameworks used to measure economic health. The psychology of failed states. The persistence of the failed state narrative reveals something profound about how international observers process information. This isn't analytical error, but reflects psychological commitments shaping perception itself. The narrative serves multiple functions for outside observers. First, it provides moral clarity. Venezuela becomes the villain where Western capitalism is the hero. This confirms beliefs about liberal democracy's superiority while providing a clear example of what happens when countries reject this model. Second, it offers intellectual comfort by making Venezuela's situation appear comprehensible. Complex phenomena reduced to simple causation. Authoritarian governance leads to economic mismanagement, leads to collapse. Third, it serves ideological functions by discrediting alternative economic models. Venezuela's socialism was watched globally by those seeking alternatives to neoliberalism. Framing Venezuela as failure effectively closes discussions about different approaches to economic organization. Most importantly, the narrative reflects the observer's paradox. Observing Venezuela through foreign institutions and measurement systems fundamentally alters what can be seen. Outside observers remain trapped within analytical frameworks, unable to perceive innovations operating according to different logics. The resource, curse reconsidered. Perhaps nowhere is conventional analysis more flawed than in applying resource curse theory to Venezuela. This theory suggests resource-rich countries experience slower growth, instability, and weaker institutions. Venezuela is cited as the perfect example. Oil wealth enabled corruption, discouraged diversification, created unsustainable spending, undermined democracy. But this misses the fundamental point. The problem isn't that Venezuela has oil, but that it exists within a global system treating oil-rich countries as extractive colonies rather than sovereign nations. The resource, curse isn't inevitable consequence of abundance, but specific product of global economic structure. Consider the counterfactual. Without oil, Venezuela would likely have remained a poor, peripheral economy dependent on agricultural exports. It would be stable, perhaps, but only because it lacked resources to challenge its position within the global hierarchy. Oil gave Venezuela options most developing countries lack: financial resources to attempt independent development, experiment with alternative models, challenge Western institutional dominance. The curse of oil wealth is actually the curse of autonomy, the burden of charting independent courses within systems designed to prevent such independence. This reframing reveals why Venezuela's experience threatens international observers. The country's problems connect intimately to external pressures and constraints, not simply internal failures. The mirror of judgment. The international response to Venezuela reveals as much about observers as the observed. The speed with which institutions dismissed Venezuela's innovations, the ease explaining away contrary evidence, the consistency predicting imminent collapse, all point to deeper problems in thinking about development, legitimacy, and progress. These problems aren't simply academic. They shape policies affecting millions, influence investments, determining opportunities, structure relationships, defining possibilities for cooperation or conflict. The failure to understand Venezuela accurately isn't just intellectual error, but practical disaster with real consequences. The persistence of failed predictions should prompt reflection about contemporary social science limitations, biases in international institutions, blind spots created by dominant frameworks. If experts can be so consistently wrong about such an important case? What does this say about their ability to understand other complex phenomena beyond the binary? Venezuela's story isn't collapse and recovery, but transformation and adaptation. The country today isn't the Venezuela of 20 years ago, nor what observers expected it to become. It's something genuinely new, an experiment in post-traditional economic organization offering both warnings and possibilities for societies facing similar challenges. This transformation has been painful and imperfect, involving genuine suffering that shouldn't be minimized, but it has also involved genuine innovations that shouldn't be dismissed. The challenge is developing analytical frameworks sophisticated enough to hold both truths simultaneously. The Venezuelan experience suggests that choices between capitalism and socialism, markets and states, democracy and authoritarianism may be false choices obscuring more interesting possibilities. The country developed hybrid forms combining elements from multiple traditions while creating space for continued innovation. These hybrid forms aren't stable end states, but ongoing processes of adaptation and learning. They represent attempts to solve fundamental problems extending far beyond Venezuela's borders. How can societies maintain autonomy within global systems? How can communities provide for members' needs without destroying their environment? How can political systems remain responsive while making difficult long-term decisions? The answers Venezuela developed are partial and imperfect, but they are answers nonetheless. Creative responses to real problems deserving serious attention rather than ideological dismissal. The country's experience offers glimpses into possible futures extending far beyond the binary choices dominating contemporary discourse. The story we tell about Venezuela reveals the limits of our imagination about what's possible. By expanding those limits, taking seriously the innovations emerging from crisis, we might discover new possibilities for addressing our own challenges and creating more resilient, equitable, sustainable social organization. The Venezuelan paradox isn't that the country failed to collapse, but that we failed to see what it became. In our obsession with familiar metrics and comfortable narratives, we missed one of the most important economic experiments of our time. The question is whether we'll continue missing it or finally open our eyes to what's been hiding in plain sight. The revolution wasn't televised because we were looking at the wrong screen.